none of whom saw what was coming. They all were giving us rosy projections in 2005. They were all predicting real estate prices continuing to rise at 10% a year. And these are the same people we put in charge after the calamity. The Timothy Geithners and the Bernankes were dead wrong for 4 or 5 years. So what do? Reward them with another 4 or 5 years to be in charge and do the same policy that got us into this fix. So it makes no sense whatsoever. But I think investors are smarter than most politicians, and investors will see through this. And I'm not sure they'll be able to fool the investment community out of this lull just with their empty words and easy credit and low interest rates again.
When you talk about auditing the Fed, or your father does, obviously some people have joined in with him. We've had Congressman Grayson join in, who's been on the show, Congressman Paul, to get the audit done. We've had Congressman Stearns join in. So what about this idea of auditing the Fed and getting this passed? Meaning, in the end, is this going to be watered down? Is that a worry that you have, that in the end this bill doesn't really get to be a full forensic accounting and really uncover exactly what the Fed is doing and what's going on over there?
I think it will be a good first step forward and put a lot of sunlight on things that have been going on at the Fed. You know, they bought $2 trillion worth of assets or debt in the last year, and we have no idea what was purchased. We're told that 40% of that debt that was bought was used car loans and bad home loans. These are things that none of the rest of us would buy. And so I think letting us know what the Fed is doing and giving proper chastisement to what they've done will be a step in the right direction. There is a chance they water it down and we don't find out any of that information. There's also a very real chance that Audit the Fed gets tacked on a bill that gives the Fed much more power, and that most of the good conservatives like my father will end up having to vote no because it'll be tacked onto a bill that's so harmful that the overall bill weighs down even the good.
Let's talk about the bailouts. And I mentioned Congressman Stearns. I'd like to play a clip from an exchange that he had with former Treasury Secretary Paulson, because I can't just bring anybody on the air to comment on this, but you're sort of uniquely qualified.
And Mr. Paulson, I hear your pain when you said you're just pained to be on that side of the table answering the gentleman's question. But isn't it true that Goldman Sachs benefited from AIG bailout? They got $13 billion and was the largest recipient of the public funds from AIG. And in fact, creating the collateralized debt obligation, the CDOs, form the basis of the current crisis we have today. But while you were CEO of Goldman Sachs, you were an active part of that business. So my problem is when you say you're pained by AIG, I go back to your bait and switch when you came here into Congress and you suddenly decided instead of buying the toxic loans, you're going to go out and start to give money to these people. So if you didn't have any credibility on the bait and switch, how do you have any credibility today to come before us and tell us that you're pained by AIG?
Well, let me respond.
Do you understand the credibility you have? You came here, you said in this 2.5-page bill that you wanted $750 billion. Then immediately after you got approval from Congress, you changed it. You baited us on, then you switched it, and then you started giving money to these institutions, the top 15 institutions, when all these people who had the loans, you could have worked out a homeowners equity plan around this country to help the people who are actually having their homes foreclosed. And you're helping AIG and you're helping Bank of America and you're bankrupting Lehman Brothers, who is your biggest competition. Isn't there some point you should have recused yourself and said, you know something, all my buddies, Goldman Sachs are over there. You know, I really feel that I shouldn't be making these decisions to make Lehman Brothers go bankrupt, that I really should recuse myself. And the fact is that you're coming here and say you feel the pain of AIG is just outrageous.
Well, I would like to respond to you, Congressman, because I find your statement outrageous.
Okay,
Mr.
Paulson. Well, let me tell you, I have the time, Mr. Paulson. Let me just say one other thing.
No, I just want you to speak into the mic. Pull the mic.
Okay.
Let me just say one other thing here. You know, when you look at, you're saying to us, you support the Obama administration giving more power to the federal regulatory, the Fed. But when you look, the Fed was on, Geithner was on board at the Fed, the New York Fed, dealing with all these institutions. He didn't get it. And then we had this fellow who came up afterwards, Mr. Friedman. He was on the Goldman Sachs board, and he didn't last too long as a Fed chairman. Why? Because he had a conflict of interest. Is it possible that there's so much conflict of interest here that all you folks don't even realize that you're helping people that you're associated with, and you should be recusing yourself for America's ethics?
Let me make several comments. The first comment I will say is I came to Congress I asked for the TARP, and I asked for authority to purchase illiquid assets.
But in 10 days you changed your opinion.
We changed because the situation changed dramatically.
In 10 days?
Rand, what is your take on that situation, that this discussion, you brought this up earlier, of giving the Fed more power, and also the bailouts? I mean, what about this bait and switch?
Well, I think one interesting thing he brings up, and I think this is what will intrigue a whole new set of people who haven't been interested in auditing the Fed, is that if people were personally and financially profiting off of this system, and obviously people do, somebody's selling and buying these bonds, but when you have a whole bunch of money dumped into the system and all of a sudden looks like Goldman Sachs is, making $13 billion off of the trading, I think the whole idea of that and shedding some sunlight on that is something that may drive the debate more and more as they see people who are individually profiting off of the calamity of this system and doing it with taxpayer money. I think people will be interested in that.
And what about the idea of giving the Fed more power? Because I can tell that you're not a fan of that, and neither is your father.
Absolutely not. One of the things I hear him say, which I really enjoy, is that, we do need more regulation over the economic system, more regulation of the Fed, that is. And the Fed is really what's interfering with the marketplace, and we need more restraint on the Fed. So absolutely right.
I'm going to play one more clip from that exchange, this one dealing with the conflicts of interest.
The next thing I would say to you, and say it very, very clearly, is I behaved with the...
You don't think you should have recused yourself when you asked Lehman to go in bankruptcy? You didn't put Bear Stearns in bankruptcy, and then you folded Merrill Lynch into... isn't there some point where you got to say, hey, I got a conflict of interest here? You don't feel any kind of scintilla of ethics on this thing at all?
Totally. I operated very consistently within the ethic guidelines I had as Secretary of the Treasury, and when it became clear that we had some very significant issues with Goldman Sachs and with
why didn't you recuse yourself
with Morgan Stanley, what I did then, it would have been very wrong for me to recuse myself. What I did was I went and got a waiver from the ethics agreement, because when we had concerns...
Who was in charge of the ethics agreement?
What?
Who's in charge of the ethics agreement that you got a waiver?
We have a office of ethics at Treasury, and we have a White House ethics office.
So you got it from the legal counsel from the White House?
We got it from the government ethics office.
The gentleman's time has expired.
What about that, Rand, when you listen to that? Isn't that the problem with government today? Because I've listened to so many of your speeches or your talks or your appearances on TV or wherever, and you talk about the corruption in government. And what about these conflicts of interest? Isn't that the whole problem with Washington today?
Yeah, and it's not just with the Fed and with the Treasury. You've got a revolving door from all kinds of large corporations who get multi-million-dollar corporations. Look at Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney, made hundreds of millions of dollars from Halliburton, and then he was back in government. And remarkably, his opinions changed on the war in the mid-'90s. He was justifying why it would be a bad idea to go into Iraq. He went to work for Halliburton, then he came back, and all of a sudden he's justifying why it's a good idea to go into Iraq, and Halliburton got a $1 billion no-bid contract. So, I think there needs to be limits on people going in and out of government, from corporate head to government, particularly when the corporations are on the receiving end of large federal contracts.
Let's talk about how capitalism is falsely being blamed for the crisis. The media, rather than blaming the elite banking interest, and the Fed is trying to blame capitalism at times for this crisis, and that is patently false, and I know you feel that way, but you made a statement, interest rates were kept artificially low, was the quote that caught my attention. And this was from a speech that you gave at the Boston Tea Party from 2008. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit? The fact that capitalism is being blamed for this, and that's not really the real truth behind this.
Yeah, I think we've been having this debate since the 1930s even. What caused the Great Depression? Was it capitalism or government? And, we had the Federal Reserve even back then. And there's some interesting analogies between the Great Depression and now, in the sense that many economists will say there wasn't much price inflation in the 20s, but there sure was real estate appreciation, and there also was a great stock market bubble. but general prices weren't going up. It's kind of what you had again between the period of time of 2001 and 2008. You didn't have significant consumer price index increases, but you did have significant housing price increases, 10, 15, 20% a year sometimes. You also had significant appreciation of assets such as oil and gold, but you didn't have general price inflation. So, I think